small-town America, early 1970s. The community hall is packed, air thick with heat and chatter. On stage stands a boy no taller than the microphone, his knuckles white around the stand. He is 9 years old, dressed in a suit stitched by his mother's trembling hands. The spotlight burns into his eyes as he begins to sing an Elvis song he has practiced in secret for months. At first, there's silence. Then the chuckles begin. Low, sharp, spreading like fire. From the front row, someone calls out, "Stop it!" Laughter follows, cruel and unrelenting. The boy's voice wavers, cracks, nearly breaks. His chest tightens, tears blur his vision. Yet he clings to the melody, refusing to surrender. And then, suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the hall creak open. The room stirs, the noise falters. A tall figure steps inside, his outline instantly recognizable, though no one dares believe it. The boy blinks through the light, his heart pounding, as whispers ripple through the crowd. It's him, Elvis Presley. Why he is here, in this forgotten town, on this ordinary night, no one can explain. But from the moment he enters, nothing in this hall or in the boy's life will ever be the same. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The town was small enough that everyone knew when a truck rolled down Main Street after midnight, or when the single screen at the cinema changed its posters. Summer afternoons carried the smell of cut grass and engine oil, and the evenings filled with the creak of porch swings. For 9-year-old Tony Miller, the world often felt both familiar and distant, as if the limits of his life were drawn by the sound of the freight trains passing through and fading into the dark. Tony's mother taught at the local elementary school. She wore the same modest dresses year after year, sewing patches into sleeves when fabric thinned. His father spent weeks on the road, driving long hauls in a rattling Kenworth, and when he came home, his face was weathered, his hands carrying the smell of diesel. Money was always counted down to the last dime. New shoes were bought one size larger, in the hope they would last longer, and the weekly grocery list never stretched beyond what was strictly necessary. But in the corner of Tony's room stood an object that seemed like it had fallen from another universe. A sun-faded guitar, its varnish cracked, a string missing. The pickguard scuffed with age. His uncle had given it to him last Christmas, claiming it was too beat up to sell, but still good enough for a boy's hands. To Tony, it was treasure. He plucked at the strings until his fingertips were raw, chasing notes he had heard on records that spun endlessly on the family's old phonograph. Those records, Elvis Presley mostly, were not just music to him. They were escape routes, promises of a world larger than gas stations and wheat fields. When Elvis's voice floated through the speaker, Tony imagined bright stages, crowded theaters, and a sea of faces listening in awe. He tried to copy the phrasing, the lilt, even the pauses between verses. Sometimes he'd stand before the cracked mirror in his bedroom, combing his hair back the way he thought Elvis did, pivoting his foot in awkward mimicry of the movements he'd glimpsed on borrowed magazines. At school, it was another story. Children noticed everything that marked someone as different, and Tony was no exception. His hair was slicked back with too much pomade, his sleeves rolled like he was heading for a show instead of arithmetic class. They began to call him Little Elvis, their laughter sharp as stones. Some imitated his stance, exaggerating a hip shake to get the others roaring. The sting of it followed him through the day, yet at night he whispered the same songs to himself, believing, perhaps foolishly, that if he sang them enough, something inside him would grow strong enough to face the jeers. One afternoon, walking home with his schoolbooks clutched tight, He noticed a colorful poster taped to the door of the local grocery store. The paper was wrinkled at the edges, but the words were bold. Talent Show, Saturday Night, Community Hall. He froze. There would be prizes, the poster said. More than that, there would be people. Neighbors, classmates, the very ones who mocked him daily. For a moment, he nearly walked away. But the thought returned, sharp and insistent. If he could step on that stage, if he could sing even one song without faltering, they might see him differently. The laughter would stop. They would know he was serious. He pressed his palm against the poster, as if to steady himself, and whispered the title of the song he would choose, Can't Help Falling in Love. The days leading up to the show were spent in secrecy. When his father was on the road and his mother grading papers in the kitchen, Tony would kneel by the phonograph, lowering the needle again and again, memorizing every breath of the song. He practiced late into the night, voice soft so as not to wake the house, strumming on the battered guitar until his hands ached. He imagined the stage lights warming his face, the hush of a crowd leaning forward to hear him. In those moments, he wasn't a child mocked by his classmates. He was a performer with something to give. Then, one evening, his mother found him. She had risen to fetch a glass of water and heard the faint murmur of melody from his room. Pushing the door open, she saw him standing barefoot, eyes closed, singing to no one but the peeling wallpaper. For a long time she said nothing. The next morning, however, when she caught sight of the poster herself pinned outside the grocery, her heart clenched. She forbade him outright. Tony, you'll only get hurt. People can be cruel. I won't let you put yourself through that. He nodded, lips pressed tight. But that night, she heard the record spinning again. When she peered in, he was seated cross-legged, whispering the lyrics, his face earnest, determined in a way she had rarely seen. Something inside her shifted. She remembered the boy's father leaving for long weeks on the road, the loneliness of their small house, the way music had become the child's armor. She could not strip him of that. And so, secretly, she began to work. After school, when papers were graded and dinner simmered on the stove, she pulled out an old sewing kit. From scraps of fabric she had saved over the years, she started piecing together a small suit. It was nothing grand, no rhinestones, no velvet capes, but the collar carried a faint echo of the outfits she had glimpsed on Elvis during television specials. She stitched late into the night, candlelight throwing her shadow across the wall. Each seam was a prayer that when her boy stepped onto that stage, he would not stand alone. The night before the contest, Tony discovered the costume folded neatly on his bed. For a long time he stared at it, fingers trembling as he touched the fabric. His mother, standing quietly in the doorway, said only, "If you're going to do this, you should look the part." He turned to her, eyes wide, unable to speak. She smiled faintly, though worry lingered in her face. Outside, the cicadas buzzed, the town silent save for the occasional bark of a dog. Inside the Miller house, a 9-year-old boy slipped into a suit stitched with love, looked at himself in the mirror, and whispered a promise no one else could hear. Tomorrow, he would stand before them all and sing. The community hall smelled of waxed floors and popcorn oil. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, scraped and dented from years of use at church socials and holiday dances. Hand-painted banners sagged slightly from the ceiling beams. Talent Show. Welcome all. By the time dusk settled, the building was alive with chatter. The murmur of neighbors greeting one another, the shuffle of children waiting nervously in line for their turn. Tony sat near the back with his mother, the suit she had made hidden under a long coat. His heart beat in his throat, his palms slick. Around him, classmates whispered and laughed, pointing at the way he carried his guitar case. He tried not to meet their eyes. The first performers went on. A girl in braids reciting a poem. A teenage boy coaxing squeaks from a violin. Two cousins performing a clumsy dance routine to a radio tune. Each act was met with warm applause, polite encouragement. The atmosphere was light, forgiving. But Tony knew the moment his name was called, the mood would shift. When the announcer finally said, "Next, we have Tony Miller," he felt his stomach drop. His mother gave his shoulder a quick squeeze, but her hand was trembling. He stood, almost dizzy, and walked toward the stage. The lights blinded him as he climbed the 3 wooden steps, his shoes thudding on the boards. For a second, silence stretched. Curious, expectant silence. Then came the first chuckle, quick and sharp, followed by another. He set the guitar aside. He wasn't skilled enough to play and sing at once. The coat came off, revealing the homemade suit. A ripple of laughter passed through the audience. Someone in the back muttered, "Look at that. Little Elvis." The words struck him like a slap, but he took a breath, stepped up to the microphone, and began. The first line of "Can't Help Falling in Love" left his lips unsteady, almost whisper-thin. He tried to draw the melody from memory, but his voice cracked on the second phrase. Whispers rose in the hall. A boy in the second row cupped his hands and called out, "Sing louder, Elvis." His friends roared with laughter. The sound swelled until it was no longer whispers but open ridicule, mocking whistles, a groan from someone who wanted the performance cut short. Tony's knees trembled. He looked down, desperate for escape. His throat closed. For one terrifying instant, he considered bolting, running straight off the stage and into the night, leaving behind the suit, the guitar, the dream. He could feel the sting of tears, the humiliation pressing down like weight on his chest. Then, as if from nowhere, a sound pierced the noise. 2 hands clapping, steady and deliberate. He raised his eyes and saw her. His grandmother, a small woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, standing in the second row. She had traveled from another town, hours away, to see him, though he hadn't known she would come. Her face was calm but resolute, her hands refusing to stop. The hall hesitated. For a moment, the jeers faltered. Tony gripped the microphone tighter. The sight of her, fragile yet unyielding, ignited something inside him. He forced himself to continue, voice shaking but present, each note pulled from the pit of his chest. But the crowd was not kind. The laughter returned, though softer now, blending with low conversations and impatient sighs. One of the judges shifted in his chair, whispering something to the man beside him. Their expressions made it plain. They thought the boy's act was little more than a joke. Tony focused on the lyrics, stumbling through a verse, clinging to the melody like a rope in storm waters. He heard the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of restlessness. His hands trembled against the microphone stand. Then came the sound that cut through everything, the heavy slam of a door at the back of the hall. Heads turned. The laughter stuttered and died. A murmur rippled through the audience, uncertain, startled. The boy could not see clearly past the glare of the lights, but he felt the change in the room, a sudden hush, as though a gust of wind had swept through. People craned their necks, whispering names. Tony faltered on a line, his voice trailing off. The silence that followed was thick, uneasy. Even the judges leaned forward, puzzled, trying to see who had entered. The hall, which only moments earlier had been filled with ridicule, now felt charged, every face drawn toward the back, where the door still swung gently on its hinges. The boy's song hung unfinished in the air. The audience sat frozen, caught between disbelief and curiosity. Something was happening, though none of them yet understood how profoundly it would alter the night. The door at the back of the hall swung shut with a low thud, and for several seconds the audience was caught in a strange pause. A tall figure stepped inside, the overhead light from the vestibule framing him in silhouette. People squinted, leaned forward, whispered names to one another, as if they could not quite believe what they were seeing. He walked with an unhurried pace, moving past the rows of folding chairs without drawing attention to himself. Yet the hall seemed to part around him, every head turning, every conversation cut short. Tony, blinded by the stage lamps, could make out only the outline. A man in a dark jacket, collar high, hair catching the glow. Then, as he drew closer to the front, the truth settled over the crowd like a shockwave. It was Elvis Presley. Gasps broke out. A woman in the aisle pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. A man whispered, "No, it can't be," as though saying it aloud might dispel the vision. But it was him, unmistakably. The same face that had filled magazines and televisions, now here, in the plain wooden hall of their small town. For a moment, the boy on stage forgot the microphone, forgot the laughter, forgot even his trembling. His heart pounded with disbelief. The king of rock and roll, the very man whose records spun every night in his bedroom, had just walked into this room as if from a dream. Elvis took a seat in the very last row, folding his hands in his lap, his expression unreadable. He did not smile or wave, did not seek recognition. He simply looked toward the stage, eyes fixed on the small boy in the homemade suit. The hall had gone utterly quiet. Tony swallowed hard, unsure what to do. His voice, already faltering, would not return. The audience, however, shifted again, whispers rising. "Why is he here? Is this some kind of show?" The judges glanced at one another, nervous, as though their roles had suddenly been stripped of meaning. The boy tried to continue the song, but the words stuck in his throat. The silence from the last row pressed on him more than the laughter had. To sing before neighbors was one thing. To sing before Elvis Presley himself was another matter entirely. Then, from somewhere near the middle of the hall, a cough broke the tension, and the murmurs returned. A man snorted and muttered, "This is ridiculous." A few others chuckled. The spell of awe was thinning. That was when Elvis stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor echoed like a strike of thunder. Every head whipped around as he moved down the aisle. His walk was steady, deliberate, each step resonating on the worn floorboards. No one spoke now. The air seemed to contract. He climbed the steps to the stage, his presence filling the space without effort. Standing beside the boy, he took the microphone gently from its stand. His voice, when it came, was calm, but carried to every corner of the hall. "Friends," he said, "how about giving this young man a chance? He's got more courage standing here tonight than most of us could muster." The effect was instantaneous. The room erupted. Not in laughter this time, but in applause, whistles, shouts of approval. People rose from their chairs, clapping with abandon. Even those who had mocked minutes earlier now found themselves swept into the current of admiration. Tony stood frozen. The applause blurred into a roar in his ears. He turned his head slightly, and there he was, Elvis, not on a record sleeve or a flickering screen, but inches away. His presence so real, it seemed to change the weight of the air itself. The judges shifted uncomfortably at their table, caught between their authority and the undeniable force of the moment. One of them fumbled with his pen. Another simply stared, mouth slightly open. For Tony, time splintered. A moment ago, he had been the object of ridicule, a boy on the verge of fleeing. Now he was sharing the stage with the most famous performer in America. He felt as if he had stepped into another world, one where the rules of his small town no longer applied. Elvis looked down at him, his expression gentle, and gave a nod that seemed to say, "It's all right. You belong here." The boy's breath caught. He gripped the microphone stand again, though his hand brushed against Elvis's as he did so. The warmth of that simple touch burned through his fear. The hall roared on, unable to contain its disbelief and delight. What had begun as a night of small-town amusement had turned into something extraordinary, an event people knew they would recount for years. The night Elvis Presley walked into a school talent show and stood beside a frightened boy in a handmade suit. The applause thundered through the hall, echoing off the wooden rafters. Tony's chest rose and fell in short bursts. He could hardly catch his breath. Elvis rested one hand lightly on the microphone stand and leaned toward him, speaking in a voice low enough that only the boy could hear. "Don't stop now," he said. "Let's do it together." The words struck like lightning. Tony stared, unsure if he'd heard correctly. But Elvis gave the smallest of smiles, then turned back toward the audience and waited. The hall grew still, expectant, as if the entire crowd had leaned forward at once. Elvis motioned for the boy to begin again. Tony's throat tightened, but this time when he opened his mouth, the sound came out steadier. The first phrase of "Can't Help Falling in Love" floated into the hushed air, and before he could falter, Elvis joined him. His voice entered softly, not with the full power that had once filled stadiums, but with a gentleness that wrapped around the boy's notes like a guiding hand. The effect was startling. Tony's thin, wavering tones no longer hung alone in the vast hall. They blended with the deep velvet timbre of a master who knew exactly how to support without overwhelming. Elvis held back, keeping his volume low, giving space for the child's voice to rise. It was not a performance of dominance, but of partnership, as though he wanted every person in the room to hear what courage sounded like when given room to grow. A shift moved through the audience. Faces that had been twisted in mockery softened, shoulders that had been shaking with laughter straightened. Applause began to bubble up mid-song, uncontainable, people clapping in rhythm, cheering between verses. Mothers clasped their hands, fathers nodded with unexpected respect. Children who had once sneered now sat wide-eyed, as if suddenly unsure of their own cruelty. But not everyone was swayed. At the judges' table, one man, the organizer of the event, a stout figure with a rigid jaw, scowled openly. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, then, with exaggerated disdain, pushed himself to his feet. His chair scraped loudly across the floor. He turned to the audience and declared, "This isn't a competition anymore. This is a circus." The words cut sharply through the rising joy, a reminder of authority, of rules. A murmur of unease spread among the crowd. For a heartbeat, the old shame threatened to return to the boy, the memory of being mocked and dismissed. His knees trembled again. Then Elvis lifted his head. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone silenced the hall. "Music," he said, looking out across the rows of faces, "has never been about medals or judges' tables. It's about the guts it takes to walk out here and give a piece of yourself. That's something worth more than ribbons." The crowd erupted. The man at the judges' table hesitated, color rising in his face. For a moment he looked ready to protest, but the swell of cheers drowned him out. Scowling, he grabbed his coat and stormed out the side door, his footsteps echoing until the door slammed behind him. Elvis didn't flinch. He kept his gaze on the boy, his expression calm, steady. "Let's finish it," he whispered, and so they did. Together they carried the song to its final refrain. Tony's voice, still boyish, cracked once, but Elvis bent his harmony around it, turning the imperfection into something raw and beautiful. By the last line, the hall was on its feet, applause thundering like a storm. Tony looked out over the crowd. Faces he had dreaded for weeks now shone with admiration. Where there had been ridicule, there was pride. He felt the weight lift from his chest, replaced by a heat that surged from his heart all the way to his fingertips. For the first time in his short life, he wasn't simply imitating his hero, he was sharing a song with him. As the clapping refused to die down, Elvis gave a small bow and stepped back from the microphone, letting the boy receive the attention alone. Tony blinked against the lights, hardly believing this wasn't a dream. The ovation rolled on, unstoppable, as if the entire town needed to wash away the cruelty of minutes earlier. When at last the noise subsided, Elvis leaned close and said, "Remember this feeling. It's yours now." For Tony, the hall blurred. The crowd, the banners, even the cracked wooden stage. All he could register was the steady presence beside him, the realization that in one impossible night, the line between fantasy and reality had been erased. What lingered most, however, was not the roar of the audience, nor the shame of the judge storming out, but the quiet strength in Elvis's words. That courage mattered more than trophies. In that moment, Tony felt seen, not as a child playing dress-up, but as someone who belonged. When the curtain finally closed and the house lights flickered on, the room still buzzed like a hive. People milled in the aisles, voices rising with disbelief. Was that really him? Did we just see Elvis Presley on this stage? Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, begging for confirmation, while teenagers swore they'd never laugh at little Elvis again. The hall felt forever altered, as though a fragment of history had wedged itself inside its walls. Tony stepped off the stage on shaky legs. He expected Elvis to vanish immediately, swept away by bodyguards or obligations, but instead the man lingered. He moved calmly toward the wings, ducking behind the heavy velvet curtain as if he had all the time in the world. Backstage was a different world entirely. The glamour of the hall disappeared into a cramped room with peeling paint, the smell of dust and perspiration heavy in the air. A cracked mirror leaned against the wall, its frame nicked with old scratches. Folding chairs sat in disarray, abandoned by nervous performers who had come before. In that worn-out space, Elvis looked almost out of place, too luminous, too magnetic. Yet he carried himself without grandeur, as though he belonged there as much as anyone. Tony stood frozen near the doorway until Elvis turned, smiled faintly, and beckoned him closer. "You held your ground out there," Elvis said, lowering himself into one of the rickety chairs. His voice was quieter now, stripped of stage resonance. "That's harder than people think." Tony swallowed. "I almost ran." "I did too," Elvis answered without hesitation. "First time they put me on television in '56, I thought I'd die of shame. Folks laughed at the way I moved. Some said I was making a fool of myself. But I kept at it. You know why?" Tony shook his head. "Because I knew the music was bigger than their laughter." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You can't let mockery decide who you are. You did something tonight that takes guts, son. That's real." For the boy, the words landed deeper than any applause. He realized that the man before him wasn't a legend on a pedestal, but someone who remembered what fear tasted like. Elvis reached into his jacket pocket, drew out a folded slip of paper, and handed it to Tony's mother, who had been standing quietly in the corner. "That's the number to my manager in Memphis," he said. "If you're ever around, come by a rehearsal. I'd like him to see this boy." His mother's eyes widened, uncertainty and awe fighting for dominance. "Mr. Presley, that's too much. He's only a child." Elvis shook his head. "Child or not, he's got fire. Fire's rare. Let him see what a real stage looks like. No promises, no pressure. Just come and watch." Tony stared, hardly breathing. The idea that the door to Elvis's world could open even a crack seemed impossible. And yet, here was the address, written in bold hand, resting in his mother's trembling fingers. The room felt hushed, sacred, as if the peeling paint and crooked mirror had absorbed something extraordinary. Elvis leaned back, smiling softly, almost like a man relieved after doing something necessary. But the spell was soon tested. As Elvis and Tony emerged into the side corridor, a local reporter lunged forward, notebook in hand. He was eager, sweat shining on his brow, his voice too loud for the narrow hallway. "Mr. Presley, why are you here? Is this a publicity stunt? Are you making this boy part of your act?" Elvis's jaw tightened. He stopped, turned toward the man, and spoke with clipped precision. "This isn't my story to tell. It's his." The reporter pressed. "But the world will want to know." "I said no." Elvis's tone cut like steel. Without waiting for another word, he guided Tony past, one hand lightly at the boy's shoulder. The reporter's scribbles would later twist into speculation, feeding rumor mills hungry for sensation. But in that corridor, Elvis made his stance unshakably clear. This moment belonged to the child, not the press. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of cut grass. The crowd that had lingered dispersed slowly, still chattering in wonder. Elvis paused on the steps, looked down at Tony and said, "Keep singing. Even when they don't want to hear you, especially then." He tipped his head in farewell, slid into a waiting car, and was gone as suddenly as he had appeared. The taillights dwindled into the darkness, leaving silence in their wake. Tony's mother clutched the folded paper as though it might vanish. Her expression mixed pride with apprehension. She knew what had just happened was too large to measure, too unpredictable to control. Yet when she looked at her son, eyes shining brighter than she had ever seen, she understood there was no stopping the path that had been set in motion. That night, lying awake in his small bedroom, the boy replayed every second. The lights, the duet, the words whispered backstage. The noise of the hall still echoed in his head, but louder still was Elvis's quiet insistence. The music is bigger than their laughter. For Tony, that truth became a flame he knew he would carry, wherever the road led. Weeks passed before Tony's mother found the courage to use the phone number Elvis had given her. Each time she unfolded the slip of paper, she hesitated. What if it was just politeness? A promise never meant to be kept. But Tony's persistence wore her down. Every night he asked, his eyes burning with the same plea. "When can we go?" Finally, one late afternoon, she dialed. To her surprise, the voice on the other end didn't dismiss her. A rehearsal was scheduled in Memphis, the man explained. If they wanted to come, they should. Nothing formal, just a practice, nothing more. So, on a bright Saturday, mother and son packed into their dented Chevy and drove south. The trip felt like entering another world. The city streets were louder, more crowded than Tony had ever seen. neon signs buzzing above diners and bars. By the time they turned down the long drive toward Graceland's gates, his stomach was a tight knot of nerves. A guard checked their names against a list and waved them through. The house loomed at the end of the lane, white columns gleaming against the sky. Tony stared in awe, clutching his guitar case, though he knew he wouldn't play it. To him, Graceland was less a house than a myth made real. Inside, the rehearsal space was already alive. Amplifiers hummed, cables snaked across the floor. Musicians tuned guitars, horns blared short bursts of sound. A drummer tapped out quick rolls. The Sweet Inspirations, the trio of backup singers, were laughing over a private joke, their voices rich even in conversation. The sheer energy of it overwhelmed Tony. He shrank into himself, suddenly aware he was a child among giants. Then Elvis entered. No fanfare, no entourage announcing him. He wore a simple shirt, dark slacks, his hair falling loose. He nodded to the band, clapped his hands once, and the room snapped to focus. "Let's run it again," he said, and just like that, the rehearsal began. Tony sat cross-legged on the floor near the edge of the stage. What unfolded before him wasn't glamorous. Songs were stopped midway, repeated again and again. Elvis frowned at missed cues, argued briefly with his bandleader, then laughed it off. Sweat darkened his shirt within minutes. He rubbed his temples, sighed heavily, and muttered about the endless grind. For Tony, it was a revelation. This wasn't the untouchable king from the posters on his wall. This was a man wrestling with exhaustion, pushing himself past weariness, carrying the weight of perfection. The image of a flawless idol shattered, and in its place appeared someone far more human, someone he could actually understand. During a break, Elvis noticed him sitting quietly and walked over. He lowered himself onto the edge of the stage, a bottle of water in hand. "Not quite the picture you imagined, huh?" he asked, half smiling. Tony shook his head. "It's harder than it looks." "Harder, and worth it," Elvis replied. He reached for the battered guitar case Tony held. "Mind if I see it?" The boy fumbled with the latch and handed it over. Elvis strummed a chord, the sound twanging sharp from the old strings. "She's got a little life left," he said, handing it back. "Play me something." Tony froze. His mother started to protest, but Elvis raised a hand gently. "Just one verse," he encouraged. "Doesn't have to be perfect." With trembling hands, Tony set the guitar on his lap. His voice quivered at first, but he forced himself to keep going, strumming along to the melody of "Love Me Tender." Halfway through the verse, Elvis began to hum, then added his voice, soft and low. The band, scattered around the room, grew quiet. One by one they turned their heads. The sight of their leader singing alongside a child with a cracked guitar was unusual enough. But the sound, fragile, earnest, and yet filled with conviction, held them. When the song ended, the silence that followed was heavier than applause. Then one of the musicians chuckled softly and said, "Kid's got more backbone than half the fellas I've worked with." Others nodded, some smiling, some simply thoughtful. Tony flushed, unsure whether to hide or grin. For the first time he sensed his voice had reached beyond himself. That others, real musicians, not classmates, had heard him and taken him seriously. Elvis clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "See? You've already learned the hardest lesson. Doesn't matter if the strings are old or the voice cracks. You sing anyway." In that moment, Tony realized the contest back in his hometown had only been the beginning. Here, surrounded by the grind and sweat of professionals, he had glimpsed what it meant to live for music. And more importantly, he had seen the truth. Even legends wrestled with fear, fatigue, and doubt. The boy carried that knowledge like a secret treasure, one that would shape him long after the rehearsal ended. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm once Tony and his mother left Memphis. The small town looked the same as it always had. Quiet streets, the steady whistle of trains in the distance, porch lights glowing against summer evenings. At school, however, something subtle had shifted. The same children who once mocked him now hesitated. Some offered nods in the hallway. Others avoided his eyes. No one called him Little Elvis anymore. Tony didn't suddenly become a star. He still struggled with homework, still mowed neighbors' lawns for pocket change, still plucked at his guitar with stubborn fingers. But there was a confidence in him now, a knowledge that he had stood on stage with the very man he admired most. That memory was his armor, shielding him from the small cruelties of childhood. Weeks turned into months. One crisp autumn afternoon, a package arrived at the Miller home, postmarked from Memphis. Inside was a plain cassette tape, carefully wrapped, along with a short handwritten note. "Never fear the stage. It belongs to you." E.P. Tony and his mother sat together in the living room, the phonograph silent for once, as the boy slid the tape into a battered cassette player. The machine clicked, hissed, then filled the room with sound. It was a recording from that day in the rehearsal hall. Elvis strumming alongside him, the boy's timid voice threading into the melody. The imperfections were there, missed chords, a crack in the middle of a phrase, but they were preserved alongside the warmth of Elvis's deeper tone. Hearing it made Tony's throat tighten. It was proof, undeniable, that he had not imagined any of it. His mother wiped her eyes as she listened, the rough paper of the letter still clenched in her hand. Outside their little house, the world spun on, indifferent. Newspapers, eager for headlines, printed distorted versions of the night Elvis had walked into a talent show. One article painted it as a publicity stunt. Another suggested the boy had been planted there as part of some promotional scheme. The journalist who had cornered them after the performance stoked the rumors further, eager for his name to appear in national columns. But inside their home, the truth lived in the tape and the letter. No one could take that from them. They didn't argue with the rumors, didn't try to correct the noise. They simply let the world believe what it wanted, knowing the real story was quieter and infinitely more precious. Years passed. Tony grew taller, his voice changed, his ambitions shifted like the seasons. Sometimes he chased music with fierce devotion. Other times, life tugged him in other directions. Yet through all of it, he kept the tape safe. It moved with him from drawer to drawer, always within reach. Then came August of 1977. By then, Tony was a teenager, old enough to understand more of the world, but still young enough to feel the raw edges of loss. The news came over the radio first, carried on a flat voice that seemed unworthy of the weight of it. Elvis Presley had died in Memphis. The house went still. His mother turned down the volume, her face pale. Tony retreated to his room, the walls suddenly too close, the air too heavy. He pulled out the cassette, slid it into the player, and pressed play. The tape crackled to life, the faint hiss of old equipment filling the silence. Then came the strum of his uncle's battered guitar, the hesitant voice of a boy, and, folding gently around it, the unmistakable sound of Elvis Presley. Tony sat on the edge of his bed, hands pressed together, listening. His own younger self sounded fragile, almost breakable, but Elvis's voice gave it weight, lifted it beyond its limits. Tears came, not only from grief, but from gratitude. Gratitude that for one sliver of time His voice had been joined with that of the man who had taught him what courage meant. The room was quiet except for the tape's gentle warble, the occasional pop as the cassette aged. Outside, crickets chirped into the humid night, unaware of the hole that had opened in the world. When the final note faded, Tony did not rewind it. He let the silence stretch, feeling both the loss and the gift it left behind. For though Elvis was gone, the song remained, etched into magnetic tape, etched into memory, etched into the very shape of who Tony was becoming. And in that silence, the boy understood. He would never again stand alone on a stage. Because somewhere within him, always, the king still sang beside him,